Battlefield 1 is being released today and it looks great. It's refreshing to see a big budget title about the First World War, and DICE seems to have gone all out with this one. They've chosen to set their game in a historical period that shaped the modern world more than most of us realize, a war of which the general populace unfortunately knows very little. DICE claims to have put effort into making Battlefield 1 historically accurate, and I understand that in making games some degree of creative freedom is necessary to keep things entertaining. But I argue that in this case, the Swedes have been a bit too liberal with their interpretation of history, specifically regarding the number of black characters depicted on the European fronts in this game. Now, DICE aims to highlight the global scale of this conflict by showing the diversity of the individuals who were affected by it, and I think this design decision makes for an interesting assortment of map scenery and weaponry. Judging by the single player footage, DICE is consistent with the ethnicity of characters and the historical context of each mission. But in multiplayer, not so much. In the early access, there is no longer a character skin customization option as there was in the beta, and instead some of the player classes have a locked non-European ethnicity. I argue that this is historically inaccurate and above that extremely disrespectful towards those who actually fought for the various factions in World War I, as they are being unfaithfully represented in favor of some ethnically diverse fantasy. To support my claim, here's a comparison between how DICE portrays the 6 factions included in the base game and what we actually know about the use of Africans in World War I. Keep in mind that I am mostly talking about the European fronts, but I will also touch upon those who fought for the colonies. Let's first look at the Americans, as it is a Harlem Hellfighter who is portrayed on the cover of this game. The Harlem Hellfighters were a small faction of the approximately 380,000 African Americans who served for America during World War I. Most of these played supportive roles digging trenches, building roads, but a little under 1 in 10 held a combat role, or about 38,000. Still, less than 1% of the troops that America sent to Europe were black. I don't know exactly why DICE chose to focus on the specific infantry regiment so much for their marketing, but then again the Red Baron and his flying circus receive an overproportionate amount of attention despite being a small part of the greater war as well, so fair enough. What does make putting an American on the cover strange is that they didn't actually enter the war until April 1917, and didn't deploy the bulk of their soldiers to Europe before the summer of 1918, towards the end of the war. And DICE isn't even an American studio. The Ottoman Empire seems to be more or less accurately shown, with an Arab or modern-day Turkish appearance of each class, as would be expected from the geographical reach of this former empire. For the British, 2 out of 4 classes are black, a third appears to be wearing a side turban, and the support has his face covered with a mask. Britain did have extensive colonies in Africa and did make use of soldiers from there for its African and Middle Eastern campaigns, but not in Europe. The British were opposed to the idea of using Africans, and though a million black army plan, following the French example, was supported by various British decision makers including Winston Churchill, this never came to fruition, in part due to logistical difficulties and an objection against using Africans alongside white troops. The notion that the fight for Europe was a white man's struggle was common in the First World War and can again be seen in the Second. In fact, the Germans, and in part also the British, portrayed blacks and other non-whites as barbarians in popular media. 130,000 of India's colonial army served in France and Belgium under British command, being deployed as early as the fall of 1914. Still, they were only part of the 8.9 million who served the British Empire throughout the war. That means that though the appearance of an Indian in British uniform may have been possible, they were a comparatively tiny part of the British Army, and assigning them as one of the 4 possible class choices is an exaggeration. But what about the Union of South Africa, who did send men to support the British in Europe? Well, among those sent were 30,000 all-white soldiers who fought in France, supported by 21,000 blacks from the South African Native Labour Contingent, 2,800 from the Cape Auxiliary Horse Transport, and 1,200 in the Cape Coloured Labour Corps. But these were all unarmed ancillary units. Therefore there is no reason to have black British soldier classes. The Italians did try to deploy 2,700 African colonial troops from Libya, but failed to do so successfully, as many immediately died from pneumonia upon their arrival and the others were soon sent back before they even saw the front. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had no colonies to draw from, but was in fact one of the most diverse armies, consisting of, in order of prominence, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Slovaks, Slovenes, and Italians, all white. Though to be fair, it looks like DICE got that part right. Finally, we have Germany. The German scout is black and is wearing what looks like a Feldrock with M16 helmet, as the German army wore on the Western Front. Germany did, like the other European powers that had African colonies, use Africans to fight, but only to defend the so-called German protectorates in Africa. Even in these, Germany mostly maintained a police force to keep the local peace rather than an army. The blacks in these forces were equipped with their own brand of uniform, which looked like this, most notably with a red hat and looking nothing like the scout class shown in Battlefield. The amount of men mobilized in German Africa was also so small that they fade in comparison to the 11 million German troops mobilized in total, with 2,500 mostly black men in German East Africa, 1,500 white mounted infantry in German Southwest Africa, and in German West Africa there were 1,600 mostly black from Cameroon and about 1,000 from Togoland that surrendered to the French and British about a month after the start of the war. And this is where it becomes exceptionally ridiculous. We see from the uniform and the maps in which Germany is a choosable faction that the Black Scout is implied to be on the Western Front. But during my research into Africans fighting for Germany, I found exactly 5 individual cases of Africans serving the German Empire in Europe. Here they are by name. Ilo Sambo, a kettle drummer in the Leibgarde Husarenregiment, Ben Isa, band member for the 1st Prussian Foot Guard, Josef Mambo, kettle drummer with the 3rd Prussian Horse Grenadiers, Kwasi Bruce, said to have fought on the German Western Front, and finally Alexander Ndumbe Douala Manga Bell, said to have seen action, but no further details are known. So there we have it. Among the 11 million men that fought for Germany in World War I, there were 5 Africans who served in Europe, 3 of which were musicians, and 2 of which might have held a rifle. And someone at DICE thought, let's make the German Scout black. So let me introduce for Team Germany, the Assault, the Medic, the Support, and Kwasi Bruce from Togoland, who was brought to Germany in 1896 to be on display in the first German colonial exhibition, and was later captured by the French during World War I. Good job, DICE. And talking about the French, they were the only ones who brought a significant number of African fighting men to Europe, 450,000 between 1914 and 1918. Also 110 Africans of European descent who were also shipped to Europe. Even at 450,000 though, this is only about 5% of France's total troop strength, which was 8,410,000 men. So in conclusion, with their multiplayer character models, DICE has grossly exaggerated the number of black soldiers fighting in World War I, especially in the factions whose uniforms identify them as fighters of the European front, where until the arrival of the French DLC in March of next year, there should be no blacks to be seen. Making the British team 3/4 non-European may be accurate when basing it off a modern-day South London census, or when staring out of a window at the DICE headquarters in Stockholm, but not in the First World War by a long stretch. Having one of the German classes be locked as African German is equally ridiculous, as there were virtually no blacks fighting for Germany in Europe at any point of the war, or even living there for that matter. DICE has made a completely false design decision in making so many of the character models for a World War I game black, one which in my mind can only be explained by a will to appease the black gaming demographic or by some dubious need to show how progressive they are as a company, pushing ethnic diversity into something where it makes no historical sense. Whether intentional or not, this is historical revisionism. The First World War is not well known to many of those who will be playing this game. Battlefield 1 may just become the most popular media through which people learn about the subject, and this gives DICE an exceptional responsibility. Being historically inaccurate when it comes to something like what gear soldiers would have been equipped with then is one thing, but misrepresenting those who really fought and died for a better world is another, and it cannot be excused with a need to be politically correct or for the sake of including minorities. As it was, most of the soldiers who died in the First World War were young white men of European descent, and though the conflict truly was a world war, this makes it primarily a European tragedy. I hope that DICE has the sense to change the character models when releasing the full game, or that at least they reintroduce character model customization, so that everyone can play what they wish. Either way, we mustn't forget that this is a World War I themed first-person shooter, and nothing more. If you truly have an interest in your history, look into it through factual sources and not only by consuming popular media. Thanks for watching.